Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Josefin Waltin is a spinner whose work celebrates the rich traditions of Swedish textiles. She's a knitter and a weaver, but primarily a spinner who uses almost exclusively the heritage breeds of Swedish sheep. Josefin, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I follow you on Instagram, which is partly for the wonderful work you do, but also partly because every morning you take a dip in a frozen body of water.
I do, every morning.
And what keeps you warm seems to be a wool hat. Do you have a different one for every occasion?
No, not really. I do have a swim cap, which is quite warm. Mm-hmm. But other than that, I have socks and mittens in the tub.
Really? You wear them in
yes,
with you?
Yes, bikini, socks and mittens, and a hat.
I suppose that's one of the amazing properties of wool, is that it works even when it's wet.
Yes, definitely.
That just seems like such an amazing pairing. And you did mention to me that it's not just while you're in the water that you are warmed by wool. Did you tell me that you have a particular pair of pants that you often wear to go jump in a lake?
I do. I knit a pair of, it's originally a pair of snow shoveling pants from the High Atlas of Morocco. And they're described in Irene Wagner's book, Keepers of the Sheep. And it's a tradition in this area in Morocco that few people remember how to knit today, but she found it in a museum and found men who knit these. And she talks about, and she learns this technique that she describes in the book. And she has adapted the pattern because it's an orally taught pattern. And she has adapted it to a Western audience. So I did knit a pair of pants like those in black and white wool. And when it's below perhaps 6 degrees minus in Celsius, I wear my snow shoveling pants when I go down to the lake.
That is wonderful.
And I do use a shovel, but that's to open up the lid on the lake, the frozen lid.
So what made you decide to choose these particular High Atlas snow shoveling pants?
Because there was such a beautiful story behind them. And the techniques that's quite different from what I as a Western knitter has learned. And basically they have black and white sheep, and I think it's the black that's most attractive or sought after color because it's more unusual. And usually the women spin this yarn on sort of a floor spindle where they sit on the ground. So it's not as tall as a Navajo style spindle, a bit shorter. And when they have finished one 2-ply skein, they hand it to their husband who knits the pants. And they're striped within these black and white stripes. And they have a really lovely way of carrying the black thread across the white stripe and vice versa, making sort of a flash pattern, a sweet construction. And they're made by trial and error, or rather trying them on an error. So you just start with an amount of stitches and then try it on, knit a few rounds, try it on and try it on and try it on to and adapt it that way. So I knit both legs at the same time. And on these pants, I have used the first and the second fleeces of one sheep. Her name is Gunvor. She's a Swedish Gästrike sheep. And she is a kind of breed that fades with age. So the black stripe will have faded in the second shearing. And I have constructed them that way. So they fade parallel on the legs and up to the hips. And so I like the idea of following their process, spinning a skein and then knitting it, and then I run out of yarn and then I spin some more. And that way I sort of understand the process, or the density of the process in a different way than I would usually do if I had spun all the yarn first and then knit. So it was quite exciting to work with it that way. And also I didn't soak the yarn. This is big no-nos in the spinning world. And I really wanted to do it as close to their original process as I possibly could. So I carded, spun, plied, and just made a skein out of it straight off the spindle. I used a longer floor spindle, a Navajo style spindle, and spun a really thick yarn and plied it. And so it was really lovely to be in that process of doing these steps after each other in one skein and then knitting it. It was a quite fast knit because it's such a bulky yarn, but it was really a lovely process.
And when you say you didn't soak it, was it washed fleece, or was it that you didn't soak it between plying and knitting?
I soaked it to wash it before I started processing the wool, but not until after the pants were done for the next time. So soaking for washing the fleece and then soaking washing the finished pants. And it was lovely to have this sudden feeling to knit with the unwashed yarn.
Kind of energized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also the lanolin smell, it felt more grounding.
It's interesting that you paired a traditional high atlas technique and pattern with Swedish sheep, and because I think that you do a lot of work with different Swedish sheep breeds. Is that right?
Yes, I use the breeds that I have close to me. That's how I started spinning in the first place. I learned about the fact that so much of Swedish wool was thrown or burnt or buried, while at the same time importing tons and tons of New Zealand merino. So that's the core of my spinning interest, that I wanted to save a tiny part of those fleeces. So I work with mainly Swedish fleeces and breeds.
Mm-hmm. And what is the character of them like? Is there a range, or do they tend to have a particular set of traits that are very different from the imported merino?
Yes, they are quite, compared to merino, coarser, absolutely. Some of them very much coarser, but everything doesn't have to be soft and cuddly. We have quite soft and fine breeds as well, but Swedish breeds have a range of qualities. You have these strong, lustrous wools, and you have the fine, crimpy ones, you have the shiny ones. There's quite a wide variety between breeds, within a breed, and even within the body of one single sheep. You can find like 4 or 5 different staple types and different fiber finenesses. So it's you can do, as a hand spinner, you can do very much with the Swedish breeds.
You know, I think that a lot of breeds like Icelandic and Shetland have started to get attention like that, but I haven't really heard as much about the variety of Swedish breeds and what you're talking about, the traits that are, you might say, primitive or are unimproved, but that are not uniform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was actually a king in Sweden in the, I think, 18th century or even earlier, that decided that the Swedish breeds were horrible because they were coarser than they wanted for weaving mills. So they imported British, Spanish, German breeds and wanted to basically extinguish the Swedish breeds. The sheep didn't care. So there were a lot of crossbreds, and the farmers didn't care because they needed all kinds of wool. For earlier it was sails, but rugs and upholstery and all things you can imagine being made by wool, including clothing. But this experiment, it lasted a couple of hundred years, didn't work very well. And in the National Romantic era, in the beginning of the last century, they wanted to find these lost or almost lost breeds again. And in the 1990s, they found lots of re-found lots of those 10 breeds that today are the conservation breeds, heritage breeds we have today, plus all the other breeds as well. But there are 10 heritage conservation breeds that have very unique features, but might not be the most commercially working breeds. But for hand spinners, they are very interesting and unique. So for me, I just love having this smorgasbord, to use a Swedish word, of breeds to just explore, basically.
Mm-hmm. And that's what really drove you to become a spinner. Were you already a knitter or a weaver? I
was a knitter. There is a picture of me when I was 15 knitting my first sweater in my aunt's garden in Austria. And it screams the 80s. This was in 1985. And I was knitting a lilac-colored sweater with penguin arms and boat neck. So check, in mohair. Check.
I was going to say something fluffy.
yes. So at 15, I knit my first real garment, really. And so I've been knitting since an early age. Everybody in Sweden learns how to knit and do other crafts in school. So that's where I learned.
But then learning to be a spinner is something that you generally have to go seek it out.
Yes.
How did you happen to become a spinner?
Well, I talked to a friend, and she had a friend who had sheep and told us the story about Swedish wool being burnt. And so I basically searched online after a course, and I found one, and my friend and I started, and we're still spinners. We started I got a box of newly shorn Swedish finull fleece, a pair of hand cards, and a much too large spindle. And that's how I learned. So Here you go. Card it, spin it, and have fun.
Sure, have fun.
I did.
Good. Actually, one of the first times that you and I worked together was on an article for Spinoff about communicating your process on YouTube and connecting with people through YouTube. What made you put up your first YouTube video?
I was so fascinated by this whole process that I wanted to show it from this newly shorn fleece to a finished product. So I just did that. And I think that was my first video. It was very popular when it came out. And then since then I've made lots more.
Yes, you have. Were you at all nervous to put yourself on YouTube as a spinner? Or was it something that you were so excited about that you had to share it?
I was really excited to share it. I have an exhibitionist inside. I've worked as a sign language interpreter for 11 years, so I'm used to having people watch me. So I didn't have a problem of being exposed like that because I was in charge.
Yeah. And then you've talked about how you had a passion for traditional Swedish wools, but you've also used a pretty wide variety of spinning tools, and then we spoke about using Moroccan patterns. So it's sort of this connection between your heritage, but going in all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, it's always interesting to explore techniques from around the world and spindle types from around the world. But I want to use the wool we have here because it's so versatile, and I want to do this sustainably and not. Of course, I've bought fleece, Shetland fleece from Shetland and Icelandic fleece from Iceland, but I want to stay as close as possible to me.
Now, of course, there is a very rich tradition of knitting and weaving and spinning, including, for example, twine knitting, two-end knitting, or colorwork knitting. Do you tend to explore those in your work?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm knitting a pair of...
What's your favorite?
I think two-end knitting and nålbinding. Also because I think I started learn both of them for the same reason as spinning, because they were techniques that had almost been forgotten. So I wanted to be a part of saving the knowledge of those techniques.
And how do you say it again? Nålbinding or nålbinding?
Nålbinding.
Nålbinding. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the pronunciation, but nålbinding. that is something that's still pretty rare, but it makes a very cool fabric.
Yes, it
does. What do you use it for?
I usually felt it or full it. So in itself, the threads go crisscross. So in itself, it's quite warm and windproof. But when you full it, it becomes like an armor. So and it's also, you can get it almost 3-dimensional because it's shapeable, and it's a technique that brings me very close to the wool. I hold the wool in my hand, and I have a hand-carved wooden needle in my other hand, and I use my thumb as my gauge. So it's very simple, very, very, not easy, but simple technique. And it's also very portable. So it's very, very slow. Both of these techniques, both two-end knitting and nålbinding, are very slow, but that's a superpower. It brings me more inward and into the process. So I tend to like those slow techniques.
Nålbinding, it almost looks like chainmail, so it makes sense that it forms something that works like armor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it has that looped structure. It really looks like those rings.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I know that there's something video of slow knitting that people enjoy watching on YouTube, something that's meditative, but that seems so much less exciting than if you actually have your hands on it and do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, because it's the warmth of the wool in your hand, and if you, like with a nålbinding, you have a hand-carved needle, you feel the workings of the carving knife on the needle. Mm-hmm. So these natural materials that you hold so close, and it's just you and wool and wood, and what can go wrong? But it takes me really close.
I don't know. Now I'm going to imagine.
It brings me very close to the process. Also, just like with spindle spinning compared to a spinning wheel, to backstop weaving compared to a big loom, the closer you are to the tools with your hands, the more I understand the process, and the closer I feel to the wool and its origin and so on. So these are important things to me, to feel close in all aspects to the material and the tools.
That's true. I hadn't thought about the fact that nålbinding, you have so much more contact with the wool than even through knitting. Yes. Because knitting, it flows through your hands, but it's kind of one and done. It goes over your finger and into a stitch, and then pretty much you let it go, as opposed to having it go around your thumb and then through, and then yeah. You mentioned having closeness with the breeds and the traditions, and you also wrote an article for Spinoff about discovering that you have a cousin who's a spinner.
Yes.
And then I learned that Kirsten Neumüller, whom I interviewed a few weeks ago, is also a cousin of yours. I feel like there's sort of these woolly links and threads that you have all over.
Yes, and it's funny because I always thought that I have no connection with spinning. I have no connection with crafts in my family. But then Cecilia, my second cousin, found me through one of my online courses. And she's very into the family, so she recognized my maiden name, which is not her name, and it's a long story. But she through her very geeky interests in the family, she understood who I was. And our mutual great grandmother was a crafts teacher, and some of her 11 sisters or something. So there is. I mean, if you go back far enough, everybody has spinning in their family, because every woman had to, basically. So, and we found our mutual great-grandmother, who was this crafts teacher, and I named one of my spinning wheels after her, Berta.
Oh, so it sort of skipped a generation in some ways.
Yeah. And Kirsten is our third cousin.
So there really is very much a sense of place in what you study. Mm-hmm. And yet, here I am in the U.S. in Colorado, and part of the audience on YouTube is certainly not just in Sweden. Do you find that folks are coming to you because you have a kinship in fiber, or are people interested in learning more about, your Swedish fiber traditions, or is it some other sense of connection?
I think the word kinship is very suitable here, because I think it's this love for fiber that's the common denominator. I decided from a very early stage when I started my blog, I decided to do it in English because, crafting is nerdy and textile crafts is even more nerdy, and spinning is so slim a part of the cake. So I realized that if I would ever have the possibility of earning a living from my YouTube videos and my business, I would have to do it in English. So when I started my blog, it was in English, and all my videos are in English. So by that, it would be natural to reach at least some English-speaking people outside of Sweden. So that was a choice.
Do you find that interest in those Swedish sheep breeds that you were interested in preserving, is it working? Does there seem to be more of a revival?
I do present a lot of Swedish breeds, but it's not mainly to promote the Swedish breeds. It's more about looking what you have close to you rather than buying fleece from around the globe, and to find the characteristics of the fleece you have. And I do that by example from the fleeces I have. So it's more about exploring what you have close to you than the Swedish breeds per se.
One of the things that we've started noticing among spinners, but even among knitters, is that there's a lot more interest in breed-specific, even commercially spun yarns, but breed-specific yarns. Among spinners, it's interest in fibers other than, say merino or merino's cousins. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious if that seems to be a broader interest in rediscovering those, particularly where you are. You mentioned that once upon a time, those fleeces tended to be, burned or thrown away. Mm-hmm. Is that getting better?
Yes, definitely. There's still a lot of wool in Sweden being wasted, but there is sort of a force of companies, organizations, and different wool-related people and connections that work for Swedish wool. We have bigger brands that I'm not sure how you pronounce this Swedish word in English. It's a brand, Fjällräven, that has done quite a few products with Swedish wools, and other Swedish brands that have limited edition series of perhaps a sweater in Swedish wool, or one company that makes dog and horse covers made from Swedish crossbred wools. So there are, on a very small scale, because Swedish sheep are bred on a very small scale. A large flock in Sweden is 250 sheep or more. We don't have these thousands of sheep farms. An average sheep farm in Sweden might be about 30 or 50 sheep. So these are small-scale businesses or small-scale farms, and then you have to adapt the wool industry to that. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of initiatives, but you have to adapt it to the Swedish wool supply, the reality of that.
It does remind me of a group in Portugal called O Saber Fraser, I think is.
Yes.
And they're trying to do something similar, maintaining the distinct Portuguese breeds and types of breeds. Mm-hmm. And in the U.S., among hand spinners, that you can find flocks of Border Leicester, flocks of Corriedale, flocks of, Bond, flocks of Jacob even. But there's sort of three scales. There's the very small scale having sort of a couple of each. Mm-hmm. Then there's the hand spinner's flock. And having something that really is a bigger ranch, they do tend to be, if you have 1,000 sheep, they're probably some sort of merino cross, mm-hmm. for example. Mm-hmm. But that sense of working from where you are, I'd like to think that that's something that's a general trend. I hope so.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah. At the same time, I love what you're doing, so I want that. I love mm-hmm. what she's doing, so I want that. So
it's interesting to see. Many especially people in America do want to buy Swedish fleece to try, because I host a series of breed study webinars on Swedish breeds, and then they ask me how can I find this breed. So that is interesting, and it's nice to see Swedish breeds being in demand. But at the same time, my main goal is, yes, I want to show the Swedish breeds that there is a very wide variety of characteristics, but also to have that inspire people to find what's available around them.
So then what's shared becomes the technique, the ethic, the sort of philosophy.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
How many projects do you tend to have going at a time?
I just wrote a blog post about that. Perhaps you read it. At the moment, I have quite a lot of projects, both spinning and knitting and weaving and embroidery. Yeah. So at the moment, perhaps 6 or 7. And I have them for different...
That's not that many.
Okay. I have them for different purposes. I have I knit my 2-end knitted sleeves at work because it's quite portable and it's nothing that craves my attention like a lace shawl would. I have one weaving project in the local weaving room. I have a band I'm weaving that I started on the train with a backstop loom, and I have one project on my spinning wheel, or two on spindles. So I use them for different purposes and for different contexts. So they all have a place, and also I think I don't want to work on a project where I've gotten bored. I want to keep the curiosity of that particular project. So when the curiosity is fading, I turn to another project and let it simmer for a while, and then get back to it when I have that curiosity again, because every project deserves my attention. I don't want to keep doing it just because I want to have it done. I want to enjoy the process and be inspired by it.
But there's still a certain ambition involved with, for example, knitting a pair of pants. That's not I'm just going to knit this for that. There's a definite goal, and it's a fairly substantial project.
Yes,
so
definitely.
You're not afraid to take on big things.
No. The pants weigh 1 kilo. So
really?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Tight knit, bulky yarn.
Well, I suppose you've got 2 fleeces from 1 sheep at least.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So speaking of big projects, I understand that you have a book that's out in a 2nd edition right now.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
Knit Spin Sweden is a book by Sarah Wolf, and I am a co-author. And she dives into mainly knitting history and how knitting came to Sweden. And it's sort of a travel book for knitters to Sweden. And she lists different where you can find yarn from Swedish breeds and interesting places to go wool-wise. And I wrote a section about spinning wool from Swedish breeds, and then I sent the yarn that I had spun to Sarah in the US, and she knitted a swatch and wrote about what she experienced while knitting it. So it was a very lovely cooperation. She contacted me through my blog and asked me to write for her book. I think I sounded quite skeptical in her eyes, in her ears, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't just something that wasn't serious. But then we developed a friendship, and we met actually in Sweden on a sheep festival that is actually going on right now. It was in early 2020, so exactly 3 years ago. This sheep festival in a very small town of perhaps 10,000 people. And for the festival, about 10,000 people come there. So it's a very special place to be. And they landed in Stockholm and rented a car and brought me with them to this little town, about 5 hours drive from Stockholm. And then we talked. And then 2 weeks later, bam, Sweden was closed because of the pandemic. But nobody I think there were 10 or 13,000 visitors on the festival, but nobody got sick. So I was just texting Sarah and said, it's the festival time and I miss you, because that's when we first met.
Yeah. The last few years have definitely been a time for people to connect online. And so if you had an established sort of practice of blogging and releasing videos, that already made you more connected with than folks who were just sort of trying to discover, how do I meet other people who are interested in the same things that I am online?
Yeah. And I think I noticed an increased activity on my different channels during the pandemic.
So what project are you excited to start next?
There are in Sweden, I think, 5 fulling mills.
Oh.
Yes, 5 surviving fulling mills. And it's a mill that is driven by water with large wooden sort of beams that in the water stomp into tubs with water where you put wool to full it. And I have a wool traveling club together with 4 friends. And our plans for the wool journey of 23 and 24 are about weaving and then stomping our wool or weaves in one of those fulling mills.
So it's woven fabric that's fulled. It's not.
Yes.
It's not felt where you start from loose fabric.
Exactly, it's woven fabric. So you would weave quite loosely to make it compact into a fulled fabric.
And do they take fabric that other people have? It doesn't have to be industrially or commercially woven. Will they take fabric that, for example, you have woven?
Yes, these mills are, I think, the one that I'm that I know of, that I've visited, used to be an industrial site and working in the 17th century. So there used to be an industry, but now it's mainly for showing what it is about. And a few crafting schools open this mill on certain weeks where they have woven and are fulling their weaves. So there are people who have access to these mills and that we can hire to teach us how to do it. I mean, it's not a playground. It can be very dangerous because there's a lot of power in these mills and these beams that are banging the weaves for about. I think it takes about 6 hours or something to full fabric.
Goodness.
Yeah, if you would do it by hand or by foot, it would take about 24 hours or something.
I've seen a walking.
Yeah.
Waulking.
Yeah.
The one I have seen definitely didn't take that long, but it was very strenuous.
Yeah, it would be. Definitely.
It was a communal activity. There was singing involved, but you were banging the cloth on the table and moving it around.
Yeah.
So you must have to meet certain specifications. You can't just give them a little scrap of something. It must have it has to be
at least 20 meters. So that's why we're starting now for a fulling mill spinning wool journey for 24. So we have to gather things, the 5 of us, to be able to meet that specifications.
You're not each going to do 20 meters.
No, together in total.
Okay.
At least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. That is a lot of work.
Yeah. So I've finished one weave and my next project will probably be another weave that I will weave to full in the mill.
And then do you have to join them together, or how does that work?
I think we will learn how to do it. I have no idea yet.
I see.
But that would probably be a reasonable approach to just lightly tack them together to make them keep them together.
Do you have a thought for what you're going to do with the fulled fabric, or is it that you'll get there?
I think it will tell me what to do with it when I see how the structure gets and so on.
I have not heard of I'm sure that there used to be fulling mills everywhere, but I have not heard of a working fulling mill before.
I did check it on Wikipedia to see the translation of the word vadmal stamp. Vadmal is a very thick fulled fabric, and stamp is the stomping. And the picture I got was something different. It was still a fulling mill, but not driven by water. It was more horizontal thing that was banging on the wool in Britain, I think. So there would probably be different kinds.
I'm also fascinated by this idea of a wool traveling club. Can you tell me more about it? It sounds like you actually have a program and it's not just something kind of ad hoc.
No, we make one journey every year with one exception, I think. The first year we went to Shetland for Shetland Wool Week in 2015. I started it with 2 friends. I said I wanted to go on courses, spinning courses, and there weren't that many in Sweden, at least not then. And I figured that if we are a group, we can hire the teacher we want to have our own spinning group. So I asked 2 of my spinning friends, and asked them to ask one person each. So there's 5 of us. And after Shetland Wool Week, at least 2 of us have stopped flying. So we generally go within Sweden by train. And we decide together where we want to go, what we want to do, what teacher we are interested in. And so decide together where we will go. So it's a lovely time. We don't really meet at other times at all during the year. We're from different parts of Sweden. So it's nice to just gather for a weekend, learn everything about everybody's family and children and what have you, and then spread out like the wind. It's a very special context to meet in. We connect instantly when we meet, but we don't meet otherwise during the year. Last time was in September. We went to a very small village called Dala-Floda, which has a very rich textile heritage, and especially an embroidery technique called på-söm. That is, på means on, söm is seam, so it's a seam on top of. So you have quite, not bulky, but very airy, at least 4-ply yarn, and you embroider these very rich, bombastic, flowery motifs with very many leaves and petals and bouquets of richness, rich colors, richly ornated, and it's very, very. It's supposed to show you that I am a good embroideress. I will be a good wife for you, yes. And everybody will show their på-söm accessories in church on Sunday when this was back in the days. And so it's a beautiful technique, and it was lovely to just learn something completely new. It was wool related, but not spinning related at all, because I wouldn't dare to spin this kind of yarn myself.
That's one of the questions I had, was whether you're using commercial yarn at all. But it sounds
generally, no. I don't buy commercial. I don't buy yarn. I spin it. But for this, I mean, I'm not a dyer, and you need these very vibrant colors for på-söm embroideries. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm using the yarns that are recommended for this technique. But it's wool. I don't think it's Swedish wool, but it's wool, and it's a lovely technique.
You mentioned that when you started, there weren't very many festivals. You said it, at least not then. Have there gotten to be more now? Learning opportunities?
I think so. Perhaps after the pandemic, but before that as well, I think. More people teach spinning, more people are interested in spinning and wool. So yes, there are more opportunities. But it's also very lovely to just hire our own teacher for the weekend, to have that very close context, to be just the 5 of us.
I know a lot of people who get together to go to festivals, but there's something really special and intimate about just having the 5 of you on the journey together.
Yeah.
Not, we're all going to go to this big event.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It was in our first journey in Shetland, but we stayed in one apartment, so there was just actually only 4 then. So we still had our very close knit group. Well,
Josefin, I am just so excited to see what you work on next. I love seeing your pictures, and I will be excited to hear more about your foaling adventures. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely.
Thanks to Treenway Silks for sponsoring this episode. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.